everybody hear me okay? Let me know if you can't or if that changes. I tend to slide around a little bit and with my care. Just by a show of hands, I thought it would be interesting to understand where everybody's coming from, not geographically, but functionally. How many, I assume most people are coming from the tri-state area, or maybe let's do a show of hands. Anybody come from outside of the tri-state area today? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, a small handful. But from a functional standpoint, you know, how many of you are working in procurement today? Okay, right. So I think it's all, it looks like for those of you on the phone, it's a largely procurement audience. So then within procurement, how many of you are focused specifically on diversity, if you'd say that that's your primary? Okay, so a small number. How about supply risk? Okay, so a stronger component there. And then how many on more traditional sourcing or transactional procurement processes? Okay, so it seems like, you know, for those of you on the phone, we've got a full room here in the Times Square Hilton that is you know, full of procurement professionals, about half of which are focused on supply risk. The other half, you know, almost half are focused on more traditional processes, and then a small group are focused on supplier diversity. So I think that that's great context. What I'm going to talk to you about, so we've talked about, we've heard about supply risk, we've heard about supplier diversity, and what I'm going to focus on today, my presentation really is on spend analysis and best practices in getting and achieving spend visibility and the benefits that leading organizations derive from having visibility into their spend. Right, so you know, I'm the founder and chief research officer of Ardent Partners, which you know, I've worked with Mike, I guess, now about 10 years ago. I have worked in this industry for about 15 years, the last 7 of which as an industry analyst. Worked previously at the Aberdeen Group, where I led the global supply management research practice before founding Ardent Partners about 2.5 years ago. You know, Ardent Partners is a boutique research and advisory firm that focuses on supply management, or the source to settle process. We really look at the strategies, the processes, and the technologies that drive the sourcing, procurement, and accounts payable processes. Mike also mentioned CPO Rising, which is a website that we publish, which focuses on the topics that matter most to chief procurement officers and other procurement executives. Now, with that brief introduction, right, so the agenda today, I'm going to focus a little bit on the state of the chief procurement officer and the evolution of the role and the function of procurement. Look also at the evolution of spend visibility and where organizations are today from a spend analysis standpoint, from visibility into spend. I'm going to talk about best practices as it relates to strategic sourcing and spend analysis, and then provide you with some recommendations and some strategies for success. Now, excuse me. So the research I'm going to present is focused on a research effort that is comprised of a market research effort that is drawn from the responses of more than 220 chief procurement officers and other procurement executives that are drawn from a global marketplace. About 60% of the respondents were based in North America, the others drawn primarily from EMEA. The research also is represented by organizations. About 75% of all participants in this study are drawn from companies with revenues of greater than $1 billion, and you know, drawn from a diversity of verticals and industries. Now, I think that, you know, before I dive into that research and really to provide a little bit of a larger context as to the evolution of procurement and where the function has come over the past 15 years, we have really seen just a phenomenal transformation in the role of procurement today. Right? So I talked a little bit, or I mentioned the website that I publish called CPO Rising. If I had tried to start that site 10 years ago, people would have asked, well, CPO Rising, is that chief petty officer? Is that chief privacy officer? You know, if you were still today to go and Google CPO, I think what you see, you know, first would be certified pre-owned cars or certified pool operators. You know, that said, we now have a chief procurement officer, or a single point of contact in about 75% of all procurement organizations. So, we've seen a transformation that has been evolutionary in nature, and one that has been technology enabled. But, despite where we are today, there's still a lot of work to be done and tremendous opportunities for the large majority of the market. And, so I'll start with a quote from a world-renowned CPO. So this is the CPO of a Fortune 20 company, well-regarded, well-renowned, and someone who really can offer hope and promise to those organizations that are still dealing with some of the basic blocking and tackling, standardizing their processes, automating their processes, managing their talent, and really driving value up and down and across the organization. So when I interviewed this CPO, this is a very mature organization, an organization whose procurement maturity has actually created now its own consulting business and drives a significant amount of revenue that's based upon best practices that were established in this organization. And so we talked about driving savings and managing supply and making sure that supply is there when it's needed. And he said those are sort of part and parcel with the daily activities. We get no kudos for hitting our savings targets. This is a group that now really seeks to influence the larger constituency, and they do so by helping on things like divestitures and identifying suppliers that, for their verticalization strategy, makes sense to acquire. They also really seek to influence the supply base and have worked over a period of years. This is a global, diversified company. They've worked over a long period of years to really develop a global supply base. One didn't previously exist. And I think that, it's interesting that what they're really seeking to do is be a steward of business processes, to be a steward of decisions. And, I think that, for mature organizations, that ultimately is the path of greatest value. Now, for those of you that, if we were to rewind back about 3 years ago, a little bit more than 3 years ago, there was a very interesting trend that started to appear in the financial reports and the conference calls that publicly traded companies were making at, so this is, a couple months after the Lehman fiasco, and we're in the midst of a global financial crisis. And what happened is companies started to report on their earnings of the final quarter of 2008 and started to look forward into 2009. More and more CEOs and more CFOs started to frame the context and success of their business in the context of success within supply chain and procurement, right? So as organizations faced very difficult revenue and growth environments, they started to look inward and to start to look on trying to control the things that they could in fact control. And so you see CEOs talking about sourcing strategies, and they start talking about, localization of supplier management, and really driving opportunities that were very key in defending the organization's bottom line, right? So you actually saw very recently, or last year, that the United Kingdom actually appointed for the first time its own national CPO. So this is a chief procurement officer who's really charged now with managing what they call their austerity program and really centralizing all of the spend for what is effectively their federal government. And so this is a trend that continues today. So while we've seen a change in the market environment, companies are growing again, the economy is certainly more secure today than it was 3 years ago, organizations are continuing in that focus, right? I think that there's a view sometimes that when times are good, that organizations are going to continue, sort of shift their focus and focus back on the revenue side of the business. But I think that the reality is that world-class organizations are able to multitask, and that a lot of the learnings that, a lot of the successes that were created in 2008, 2009, and 2010, many procurement organizations and CPOs really stepped up when they were really most needed. Those learnings don't just dissipate, right? They're able to continue on in those processes as they seek to then establish and revamp the rest of their business, right? So, we see now about 20% of all CPOs report directly to the CEO of their organizations. And, if you were to go back 10 years ago, this is, procurement was a relatively staid, outside of manufacturing, a relatively staid function, back office, and, the concept that, CPOs really were rising to the board level, were really rising to that level of visibility is something that is quite impressive. We have, one CPO who works in oil and energy who actually, as part of his MBO targets, has a very specific per share target as part of his organization's delivery. So you're starting to see even a more direct relationship between the value that procurement can deliver and the actual enterprise value of an organization. Talk about the UK again. Their targets over the next couple of years is to start driving what's effectively $5 billion in savings from basic procurement strategies of supplier rationalization and centralization spend. So, procurement organizations are rising. CPOs are clearly rising, and so the question is, so in a difficult revenue environment, it becomes clear that organizations need to focus on the things they can control. And, why are CEOs continuing to talk about procurement, and why are CFOs continuing to talk about procurement? The short answer is really evidenced here on the slide. There's phenomenal leverage that can be gained from success within a procurement operation, right? So what I'm showing here in this chart are the amount of revenue that's required to drive a $1 million profit based upon a company's profit margin. So if you're working in a business that has a profit margin of 4%, it means that you need to generate $25 million in revenue to generate $1 million in profit. And so if you think about your organization and the amount of investment that's required to drive $25 million in revenue, think about all the salespeople that are involved, the account managers. Think about the production that's required. Right? Think about the delivery. Think about all of the IP that's been invested in the products and services to generate that $25 million in revenue, and how that translates to $1 million in profit. Now think about your own procurement organizations and what it takes for your group to deliver $1 million in savings to the organization, right? The profit and the savings really do equate to about the same thing, and so there's really phenomenal leverage in procurement, and this has not gone unnoticed. So a little bit of the background, and so a little bit of the research, right? So when you talk to, and so we surveyed again about 220 CPOs and other procurement executives drawn primarily from large organizations. What are the top business pressures? What are the things that you're really most focused on and are really driving your priorities? And what we see here is that savings, hands down, is the top pressure that continues to drive and keep CPOs engaged in their business activities and then their general corporate on their general procurement department strategies. Now, what we have seen over time, and so I guess I should mention that over the past 7 years I've benchmarked and surveyed thousands of distinct procurement organizations and have done that over different snapshots. The savings has been and will continue to be a top procurement focus and a top business pressure. What does change is that there is an ebb and flow that really does match the business environment. So when times were tough 3 years ago, that number was about 95%. It was really a top priority. And I think that's, I think it's a very good thing. Procurement from a performance goal standpoint, savings makes total and perfect sense. From a performance evaluation standpoint, it becomes a little bit more of a nuanced conversation, but CPOs focus on pressure, right? So there's the non-headline. What is more interesting is that, when you would typically see procurement organizations focus on driving more savings, what are the strategies, what are the things that they're doing to drive that savings, you would typically see that sourcing would be the primary lever of driving savings, right? So if you source more, the argument is that you're likely to save more. But what has started to change, and this really I think is reflected in the evolution or the growing maturity of procurement organizations, is that collaboration now is really viewed as a top or key strategy. You have procurement organizations that on average manage about 60% of their spend. For them to continue to go back and to source out of the spend that they're already managing, I think is effective. But where the larger opportunities lie is in the spend that isn't managed. And so by collaborating with the business and becoming a better partner, the opportunities to place more spend under management and to source new categories really is one of the drivers and the focus of CPOs today. So we've talked a little bit about chief procurement officers and where they are. Let's look at the state of spend visibility, also drawn from the same research effort. And so what I want to do here is pose a little bit of a hypothetical, right? So imagine you're the CEO of your organization, and you're looking at reviewing your company's business, and you reach out to your CFO, and you're very interested in understanding from your CFO, what's your cost of capital? What are the current liabilities? What's the financial position of the company? How do we look? How are we looking at this quarter, and how do we look going forward? And your CFO says, those are great questions. I don't have the answer for you today. Bless you. It's going to take me about 6 weeks. I'm going to run some reports, and I'm going to come back to you with an answer that I'm not going to be very sure about, and I'm also not going to have too much context on. That would be very troubling, right, to say the least. Right? It's not likely that that CFO would be working there tomorrow if they give that answer. Now let's call up your VP of sales, right? You call up a guy like Mike Conway. You say, hey, Mike, what's our pipeline look like this quarter versus last quarter? How are we looking? How long does it take us to close a deal? What's our win-loss ratio? We've got some analyst calls coming up. We want to understand what our revenue is going to be in our next fiscal year. And the VP of sales says, those are great questions. I'm really glad you asked. I don't have the answers at my fingertips, but if you give me 6 weeks, I'll come back to you with some numbers and a report that I'm not going to be really sure about, and it won't have much context to it, right? This is an organization that's in trouble, right? So then you go down the line, say, let me talk to the VP of manufacturing. And you say, we're trying to do a product rationalization. We want to understand, what costs are more profitable than others, what products are more profitable than others, what's our quality like, what's our value proposition to our customers. Help us understand that so we can explain it to the market. And the VP of manufacturing says, 6 weeks, come back to you, run a report, not going to be sure, right? What would you do, right? I mean, if you're the CEO, is this incompetence? Is this malfeasance, right? I mean, it's probably a blend of both, right? I mean, this is a company that you certainly wouldn't invest in. If you're the CEO, that executive team would be fired, and probably your job is at risk as well, right? What could you do? What would you do, right? Big problems. Now let's go and pose a similar hypothetical. Now, everybody here is here for procurement. Put yourself in. Is anybody here a chief procurement officer? Okay, so you can play yourself here. Everybody else can pretend to be your chief procurement officer. Let's look and ask yourself, what if you didn't really understand what you were buying, from whom, you didn't really understand the contracts that you did negotiate, who was buying against them, how effective they were the SLAs being managed. You looked out and you didn't really have a clear sourcing pipeline, and as far as what people were doing on a day-to-day basis, you weren't really sure, right? That would be problematic, wouldn't it? Right? Absolutely. Now, the problem here is in the first example, I gave you a hypothetical. Second example is that we're really looking at the market today. And what the slide here shows you is that only about a third of all organizations today have a standardized spend analysis process in place. And just slightly less than that number actually have full visibility into their spend. And so when we think about all of the, sort of stumbled through the first part, but what I was trying to say is that procurement really has come a long way, and that chief procurement officers have become, these very important people within organizations, right? Would you say? Very important person. She's nodding her head. With an ability to influence spend and to drive great value. And on the other hand, we have the vast majority of the marketplace that doesn't have visibility into their spend, and beyond that, doesn't really have a process around managing that spend. And so that really becomes the dichotomy, right? So if you want to make the case that procurement is this strategic function, where 1 in 5 CPOs is reporting to the CEO, it's very difficult to make the case that you are this strategic function if, sort of the underlying data that really drives your business and should drive your business decisions is not available, right? And so, this is not, to chastise and to, point fingers, but I think that, the reality is that for procurement organizations who are operating without spend visibility, the term I've come up with really is that you're committing procurement malpractice, right? And so, the numbers are striking, right? And when you think about the quantitative value that spend analysis programs have been shown. I've done a good number of reports that really show, an increase in savings. We're going to talk through some of the best practices in a second that really help organizations realize that savings. But the fundamental point when you look at best-in-class organizations is that their visibility into spend is the foundation upon which they really drive all of their other, from which all of their other successes are built upon. And so, sort of painted a picture of the marketplace and talked about organizations and a large group in the market that does no real level of spend analysis, that lacks spend visibility. So we're going to pivot now, and we're going to talk about organizations that actually do have spend visibility and some of the best practices that they employ. Right? So, for the 2/3 of organizations that don't have a standardized spend analysis process in place, right? And so spend analysis is, well, first, I should define it as first both the process of, we'll talk through right here, but it's also the tools that automate that process. And so, I think, the first practice is to develop a standardized approach to how you manage your spend. And it starts with, identifying where the spend is located and then extracting it. And then starting to organize it and get it into a format that is usable, right? So if you think about the challenges that procurement organizations face, where does most of the spend data exist, right? So it may exist in the procurement system if you have it, but for a large part, the data exists in transactional engines, right? It's the back-end ERP or the accounts payable system. And while ERP systems do some things very well, what they don't do well is manage procurement spend data and to present it in a way that's both usable and and analyzable. And so the spend analysis process really is focused on extracting that data and then organizing that data and getting it into some type of category or commodity schematic that is really reflects how your organization does its buying, right? So you identify where the data is, you get it all into a centralized repository, and then you begin to organize it into that schema. And then, what you need to do, because the data in and of itself is, it lacks the context of, who the supplier actually is, or the relationships that different organizations within a large company, have. You need to go and actually look to enrich that data, right? And so, the data enrichment process helps organizations understand things like parent-child relationships. So you can understand that if you're buying from one entity and another entity and another entity, that's actually just one supplier. You look at things like diversity spend, which our hosts here really, really led the market in, and really were the, the leading and first folks in really helping organizations understand, that part of the supplier profile. Beyond that, once you have this data organized, you need to have a way to present it so that it's usable, so that your organization, and when you talk to CPOs and ask them to evaluate the different strengths of their staff, oftentimes the two areas that are most lacking in procurement organizations are the general business consulting skills, right? So the ability to go in and meet with a stakeholder group and manage a project and to really communicate well the key milestones and to drive that project through to fruition. And the second piece is the actual financial or analytical skills of actually being able to look at data and to make decisions based upon that data. So best practice organizations and best-in-class organizations utilize reporting tools to help present that data and actually have data sort of forced out to your specific buyers and to the sales team so that they can see where specific opportunities may exist. And then, the piece after that is the analytical piece, which, is enabled by technology, but, is really driven by the expertise of the organization. So, standardized process is the first best practice. And so second best practice is the linkage, right? So, how do you turn this data into value, right? And so, it's, the best of the world-class or best-in-class strategic sourcing organizations that take a very holistic approach to their strategic sourcing process, right? They have a process that starts with spend analysis and ends with contract execution, and then oftentimes continues through supplier implementation if it's a new supplier. What we see is that the organizations that are cohesive in their approach and link spend analysis to sourcing in a very direct way save more than 50% more on the average sourcing project than those that don't. Now, despite that, when we look at organizations today and where the breaks are in the process, we see that, about 40% of organizations, really do sourcing without any, context or view into the spend for that specific category. We look at, completing a sourcing project, there's also this other disconnect, about, almost 40% again, between making a final contract award decision and the actual execution of a contract. And what happens is these processes break is that there's an erosion of value, right? So let's focus on the e-sourcing and contract standpoint. We see that, the average contract compliance rates in the market today are about 60%. So organizations that have invested significant amount of time and resources in identifying the highest value supplier are only seeing about 60% of the spend go against those contracts. And what happens and what we've seen is that there's a real cost for that non-compliance. Right, organizations spend anywhere between 6 and 12% more on every dollar that's non-compliant. Right, so these are, beyond the fact that you've invested, significant resources and time and effort, and you're not sourcing every category, and you have limited means. Failure to really fully optimize on these opportunities happen when there's break in the process, and we're focused more on spend analysis here, and again, just to sort of reiterate the point. Organizations that fail to connect spend analysis with e-sourcing, or those that do connect spend analysis and sourcing, see on average a 50% greater savings rate on the average sourcing project. So, second best practice is linking processes. Now the third best practice is process automation, and what we see in the pie chart is that about 70% of organizations have started to automate some aspect of their spend analysis process, right? So that's highlighted in the blue and it's highlighted in the red of the pie chart. How that translates over, right? So, once we've identified, the level of automation that exists within the spend analysis programs, we ask more generally, what's your annual savings, right? So, what's the value that you're driving, reporting back to the organization from an all-in savings standpoint, and you see, a very dramatic difference here, right, between the fully automated and the fully manual, right? And so, there is correlation, if not direct causation, with organizations that, have spend analysis and have full visibility into the spend, are able to identify prioritize, the most compelling sourcing projects and put them at the head of the line. Right, they're able to aggregate more spend, and by and large, we'll see in the next chart, they're also managing more spend, and across the other primary procurement metrics, really driving significant value. So, we've talked about process standardization, we've talked about process linkage, we've talked about process automation. Other component, right? If you really look at the if you look at the overall, strategy for success of sourcing, or the formula for sourcing success, there's a couple other components that need to be added to this, right? So presenting data in a great format that's usable is one part of the process, and it's that first part. But, the other components that sourcing organizations really need to bring into the mix are having, excellent sourcing process capabilities, right? So having standardized sourcing processes, having an ability to match the level of rigor to the of process to the opportunity that exists, right? So having process standardization doesn't mean you do the same thing all the time. It means that you hit upon, the same, key areas, relative to the sourcing opportunity. Best-in-class organizations have supply market expertise, which is also important. If we think about, the impact of globalization on, clearly on the manufacturing environment, right? Where, Bill mentioned, 10 years ago, we're talking about lean and the move to China. That move to China is now a move to Africa. And, the world and, the impact of globalization, the impact of technology, has really changed most supply markets, right? So even those of you that are working in financial services or in IT, as you start to look at how much of your spend is now being, or how many of your resources are being outsourced, and where those resources are located, right? There's organizations now, Cairo is a top 10 outsourcing hub, and, what happens in the spring uprising, now has a potential impact on a large IT organization that outsourced their IT call center. So supply markets are changing. It's created a level of competition that has been very beneficial for those focused on savings, but it's also added, as Bill talked about, a very different element of risk. It also means that if you are dealing with the same suppliers in categories, 5, 7, 10 years, and sort of just renewing them. I mean, markets are moving much faster now, and it's less likely that the lead supplier 10 years ago is still the lead supplier in that category. We talk about category management, and best-in-class organizations really thrive in that area. They understand not just what the component or the service is, but how organizations are using it, how it's procured, and building into the contract the right level of SLAs or rationalizing requirements so that you're not buying something that's overspecified, but actually buying what it is that's being used. And then, clearly, from having an understanding and visibility into your spend, you're able to get your resources put against the opportunities that are the greatest. Right, so, we talk about best-in-class and, what does that mean? And so, Ardent partners, best-in-class are the top either 15 or 20% of organizations that excel in certain areas within a specific research study. In the research study I'm presenting here, the best-in-class is really defined by the organizations that manage the highest level of spend. And so, for best-in-class, we qualify those as those organizations that manage more than 80% of their total spend. And is everybody here familiar with the metric or the concept of spend under management? I see general heads raising, but spend under management continues to be we feel one of the most important metrics from a procurement organization performance standpoint and from a maturity standpoint. Having an ability to influence, like the chief procurement officer from the quote at the beginning, and to influence the large majority of spend really presents the opportunity to drive savings. It really presents the opportunity to improve your compliance rates. And if you were to think of savings as somewhat of an abstraction between how much direct influence a procurement organization actually has on that number, having the influence and guiding organizations into relationships with suppliers that deliver the greatest value is really what procurement organizations should be striving for in our view. And so the best-in-class are managing more than 80% of their spend, and one of the tools that they're utilizing is spend analysis. And so they have visibility into their enterprise spend at a significantly greater rate than all other organizations, and that cascades down, right? So when you are managing almost 90% of your spend, you're able to identify those best opportunities for sourcing, and that allows you to have a higher savings rate. You're able to see and track transactions that are compliant and non-compliant, and while there's still an opportunity to improve compliance here, even for the best in class, the cost of non-compliance is significant. And so, sort of the underlying or the foundation of these primary metrics is the fact that best in class have visibility into their spend. Right? And so when you look at sort of a thumbnail sketch of what's a best-in-class procurement organization, what does it look like, how's it staffed, how's it organized, some of the things that stand out, and this is not just from this specific research effort, but from others in the past, you see, a focus on talent first and foremost, I think, from the chief procurement officers who take a very vested interest in developing the skill sets that are most important for success. And so, where, most organizations have some level of procurement process and sourcing expertise, best-in-class differentiate themselves by having staff and resources that have a broader set of skills, right, broader consulting skills and more consultative in their approach, which allows them to go and be better partners, which allows them to be better collaborators and to engage more business stakeholders within the organization. From a process standpoint, I think I hit upon the primary areas, right? I mean, they have standardized processes. They have process linkage. They have process automation. And, I think that best-in-class, really do have a very good understanding of the importance of spend visibility and have that as a priority. That's not always the case with procurement organizations, as we've seen. Then, not only are they, generally stronger adopters of technology, but they have wood behind the arrow. They have programs in place to really drive adoption and to really track that in a significant way. And so, what are some of the strategies or, recommendations that we have? How can your organization really become a best-in-class procurement organization? Start by looking again and sort of reiterate the value from spend visibility, right? So, in research that I've done, we've seen that organizations in a before and an after standpoint have been able to improve the percentage of spend that they've placed under management after deploying a spend analysis program by about 40%. And so organizations that place spend under management, drive significant values, and in a more anecdotal way, we see CPOs talk about a number between 6 and maybe 10% of extra value just by gaining that level of control. Talked about spend visibility and showed you the charts that showed the difference between spend analysis automation and those that are operating in a fully manual environment, and the gaps are the very big gap in savings. But again, those organizations that utilize spend analysis even in a fully manual way and link it directly to their sourcing processes save slightly more than 50% on their average sourcing project, right? So, that's where the rubber hits the road, right at that convergence point. Having visibility into spend allows you to see view your transactions and understand, what transactions are compliant and which are not. And then from a process efficiency standpoint, you're better able to allocate your resources against the largest opportunities. So, what should you do? What are some of the key takeaways, right? Ultimately, the recommendations are, follow the path of the best in class and look at what you're doing from a spend analysis standpoint today, right? So, it's clear that budgets may not allow for an investment in a spend analysis solution today, but you can begin with a manual process and then work your way up. Clearly, the tools that automate this process, which can be difficult in a manual environment to leverage the IT department on a regular basis and deal with unlike data. That process can be difficult in a manual, doing that in a manual way. So, the investment in spend analysis tools, delivers a very strong ROI. Beyond the focus just on the spend analysis process and the tools, I think that organizations, right, so where the value, really, exists and takes form is in the savings that are delivered. And, one of the strong recommendations that we have is to, develop and maintain an active sourcing pipeline that, is actually, something that is focused on a regular basis and actually has more categories and opportunities in it than your team can actually manage, because as you know, or as many of you know, as you go through the sourcing process, many categories fall out for a variety of reasons. And so, last set of strategies and recommendations, as you look at the importance of spend under management, I think that, more and more procurement organizations are, focused on savings, or many organizations are focused on savings, but more and more organizations are starting to focus on the metric of spend under management itself. And, we think that, we've seen a very good correlation to those organizations that understand what it is that they're spending and with whom, and the other metrics that result. Clearly having a focus on compliance and tracking that, and really having a mechanism to, I guess it depends on the level of engagement that your procurement organization has with the larger company, but, find a way to, target maverick spenders and, either chastise them or, suggest that they change their behaviors. And then, finally, one of the things that we're starting to see from a spend analysis standpoint is that organizations are starting to use the pricing trends of the past to begin to understand from a budgeting perspective what potential costs will be in the future. And so, that's presentation on spend analysis. So I'll open up for any questions that you may have. Question?
I'm on the supply side of this formula, and we just recently had our first procurement procurement process where a client says, if our staffers don't use the process, you, not the employees of the organization, may not need, you run risk of not being paid for the accommodation side. So you run the risk of not being paid by us if they don't go through the system. And it's, from a supply standpoint, somebody walks in your door, calls in by a credit card and wants to self-pay for their stay.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a hard discipline internally to, in my internal customer being the GMs that are trying to look at the numbers, say, sorry, can't take that piece of business.
Right.
Is there any statistics around compliance inside, say, Fortune 500 companies that are using e-procurement tools or procurement processes in general for internal compliance with their own?
Sure. So the question for those on the phone was regarding internal compliance and compliance rates and some of the challenges. The question was really coming from the supply side. What we've seen in the market today is that contract compliance is at about the 60% level, right? So not fantastic, but when you look at it, organizations are also managing about 60% of their spend, and that they're not necessarily involved in developing contracts, negotiating contracts for that other 40%. It's okay, but you do see a large number, and particularly of large organizations, that really have challenges with non-PO spend, right? So it's the large consulting projects, it's the things that you don't buy from a catalog that can pose a very significant challenge. One, in who's executing those contracts, and then how they're being invoiced and paid, and how they're being tracked. And so organizations really have, as a first step in their maturity, often implemented a no PO, no pay type of environment. And that's one that, again, is, sort of first getting your hands around the spend, getting your hands around the opportunity first, and then figuring out, can you change policies to better manage supplier behavior. Certainly when you talk about P-card spend, though, if transactions fall below some dollar threshold, you would tend to see that the P-card program would be acceptable. So, one more question, and then we'll go.